recognize a Polish woman abroad. Buy her John Paul II fridge magnet, her stock of pickled cucumbers, and her certainty of being on the right side of history in the Second World War. Polish people weren't all anti-Semitic like the Nazis. My family even concealed Jewish people, like some of their compatriots. This was me 4 years ago when I found this story on the website of the Figaro, one of the major French newspapers. Eugène Lazowski and Stanislav Matulovich, two Polish doctors, created a fake typhus epidemic during the Second World War, which saved 8,000 Jewish people. Amazed, I contacted the writer of the article, Noemi Alioa.
I came across the story by chance, and then I looked. I think this man must have a Wikipedia page. When you write articles for the website, they're based on articles that have already been written, but my article was very, very widely read. It was one of the most read articles on the Figaro website for several weeks. It had all the ingredients of a good story. It was almost incredible.
8,000? That's 6 times more than Oskar Schindler, the famous Nazi industrialist, I said to myself. And no one has heard of him? I need to show Spielberg and the world that they'd missed the real truth, that a Pole has done better than a German. I decided to investigate. Dr. Lazowski died in 2006 in the United States, but he wrote an autobiography entitled My Private War, Memoirs of a Military Doctor. Although it was long out of print, I managed to find a copy. But was I the only person who had? Did the experts know about him? I soon met Agnieszka Haska, who works at the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw on relations between Poles and Jews during the Second World War. Marek Wiatrowicz from the Stalowa Wola Museum in Poland. And above all, John-Yves Patel, a researcher and former diplomat. He's one of the greatest international experts on Poland. This is Eugène Lazowski's book. Have you heard of this Polish doctor who is said to have saved 8,000 Jews?
It's a nice book, but I'm not sure that it's true because it seems a bit unlikely. Saving 8,000 Jews in this way at that time, given the climate of repression against Jews and the reign of terror against Poles, seems implausible to me.
Do you know this book?
Yes, I know this book. It's the typical story of a smart Pole who put one over on the Germans. I'm not shocked by the figure of 8,000. As a historian specializing in the Holocaust, my first reaction is to say that it needs to be investigated. Stories about the Holocaust can very often seem improbable, but they really did happen. It's the role of the historian to check these things.
The autobiography is the only document I have at the moment which testifies to the doctor's story and his rescue operation. The first surprise is that the doctor says nothing about the people he saved. Were they Polish? Jewish? How many were there? How much faith should I place in a memoir written 50 years after the events?
I would take the doctor's book very seriously. He seems to be intelligent, honest, and accurate about the events of that time. He doesn't seem prone to fantasy.
To shed some light on Eugène Lazowski and his exploits, I've decided to take the historian's words literally. The doctor's autobiography will be my starting point. Written in 1993, the book will help me retrace the path of the man I hope will be the Polish Schindler. Through the words of Eugène Lazowski, I'm immersed in the Poland of my grandparents in the early 20th century. Eugène Sławomir Lazowski is born in 1913 in Częstochowa. He's the only son of Zofia and Kazimierz Lazowski. In 1933, the family moves to Warsaw, the capital of a country which recently regained its independence after being split for 123 years between Austria-Hungary, Russia, and Prussia. Eugène grows up in a multi-ethnic Poland with a Catholic majority, where there are Ukrainians, Germans, but also 3.2 million Jews, the largest minority group.
This Poland was very much structured by two opposing visions of the identity of the Polish nation. There was one vision which considered the nation primarily on the basis of citizenship. Everyone was equal to everyone else, and everyone was a citizen, whatever their origin, nation, culture, etc. And in opposition, there was the National Democracy, which was a nationalist party. And this vision obviously created foreigners, and one of the most important groups of foreigners were the Jews. This wasn't unique to Poland. It existed in France with the politician Charles Maurras. This vision of the nation existed in all European countries.
The Republican option won out over the nationalists. The first Polish constitution guaranteed the same rights to all its citizens. But in the 1930s, Poland succumbed to the temptation of anti-Semitism spreading throughout Europe at the time. This was the time when Eugène joined the Medical University of Warsaw.
There was discrimination in universities and schools, where they brought in so-called ghetto benches. So there were quotas, and they said that in a university there could be no more than 8%, 6%, or 4% of Jews.
At the university, Eugène Lazowski must have seen ghetto benches. He must have witnessed anti-Semitic demonstrations by small groups from the extreme right. There are famous photos in which you see banners over the entrance demanding quotas for Jewish students. He must have heard stories that were very well known at the time about professors or students who were beaten up for refusing the ghetto benches.
They tried to isolate the Jews by making them sit on the left-hand side of the lecture theatre. We medical students immediately spread out over the whole room to occupy the side reserved for the Jews.
My intuition was right. According to his book, Eugène hadn't compromised himself. At that time, he was preoccupied with other matters. In the summer of 1939, the carefree, respectable young man was traveling across Europe with his fiancée Maria, known as Mirka. Rome, Venice, Paris, Vienna. Without knowing it, the couple were enjoying their last moments of peace.
At dawn on 1st of September, the Germans began their work of destruction, the extent of which we didn't yet realize. That day, I was on duty at the hospital. The telephone didn't stop ringing. Messages poured in. Everyone's expression was grim. This was war. I received my mobilization orders. I had to stand ready.
As if one war wasn't enough, Poland was invaded on the 17th of September from the east by the Soviet Union. It was a direct consequence of the pact between Hitler and Stalin, who wanted to split the country. Caught in a pincer movement, the Polish army was defeated at the end of September. After mobilization, Lazowski was taken prisoner by the Germans, but he managed to escape from a convoy going to the Soviet Union and took refuge with his parents in Warsaw. But under the Nazi regime, the reign of terror took hold.
The daily life of a non-Jewish Pole. And for Jews, it was even worse. The terrible thing was that a man could be arrested at any moment and sent to a forced labor camp in Germany. They deported over 2 million Polish people.
Warsaw became too dangerous for Eugene. At the end of 1940, he left his parents and moved to the countryside with his fiancée Mirka, whom he soon married. I'm following in the doctor's footsteps to the southeast of Poland. It's a 3-hour drive to the small town of Rozwadow. Now a district of Stalowa Wola, the neighbouring large industrial town, Rozwadow has kept its old-fashioned charm. For 4 years, the Lazowskis lived here. But it was also the backdrop for the typhus epidemic which Eugene supposedly faked.
Rozwadow was famous for its large market that was held twice a week. People came from far and wide to do business. There had also been a courthouse there for many years, which increased the town's prestige. People came for administrative reasons. It attracted large numbers of people. There were a lot of events.
Rozwadow has definitely changed. First of all, I'm looking for the doctor's former clinic at number 23 on Rozwadow's Central Square. This is where he worked and lived with his wife. It just so happens that someone else is making a pilgrimage to Rozwadow at the same time as me. Mark Gerard, none other than the grandson of Dr. Lazowski, has just arrived from the United States. Mark has found a guide, also called Mark, who's an amateur historian in the town, a Pole who speaks perfect English. I join them on their visit and we go into the doctor's former clinic.
This part of this first room was the office. And from what I understand, the doorway was on this side. And the office, pretty small office. So much smaller than I imagined. It was pretty rough here. There was a lack of food and lack of medicine, a lot of sick people coming through. And the doctor was just busy helping everybody, delivering babies, you know, treating cuts and small things too. This would be the room where they would be living, and this is Mr. Skro.
Hello.
This is Dr. Lazowski's grandson.
This is where your grandfather's bedroom was. There was a stove for heating.
Because the heater was here.
Their bed was here. And they slept here.
Says they would have a bed here, they would sleep
There was a
here,
door here.
and there was a door to a hallway.
This was the kitchen area for your grandfather and grandmother. This was Dr. Lazowski's consulting room. He was very popular and very much in demand. He was the only doctor in the region. There wasn't even a dentist here.
In Rozwadow, Eugene not only looked after the local population, but also the many refugees expelled from Western Poland, which was annexed by the Reich. The doctor's task was difficult. Medicines were rationed by the occupying force, and hygiene products like soap were in very short supply, allowing the proliferation of bacteria and the spread of viruses.
Here they were as a village doctor, which I'm sure is not what he envisioned becoming. It's moving. It's like I imagined, but it's, you know, funny seeing it.
There's a picture of when they're working in the yard. This building is still here.
Oh, sure is.
This one.
And the yard went all the way back.
Yeah, it was right about here. See this fencing?
Right.
It's just right about of this building here. So this is Kochanowska Street.
There was a Jew down there. There was a Jewish family here too.
So the doctor's neighbours were Jewish. It's the first time I've heard about the Jewish population here. But they can be seen in old photos of the town.
In Rozwadow, there was a large Jewish population. It was pretty traditional. It was an area of Poland where the Jewish population was concentrated in all the large towns and in medium-sized and small towns. For example, in the town of Oswiecim, near where the Germans built the Auschwitz concentration camp, the mayor in the 1930s was Jewish. It was a town where most of the population was Jewish.
Some people had assimilated, and others were Orthodox Jews, who could be recognized by their clothes and their kippah. There was a large Hasidic Jewish community. There were lawyers wearing suits, or doctors who couldn't be differentiated from non-Jewish Poles. Some spoke perfect Polish. Others only spoke Yiddish at home.
I learned that before the war, 2/3 of Rozwadow's residents were Jewish. To find their trace today, I need to delve into memories to revive older people's recollections. Do they remember their neighbours back then?
I remember that the Jews were mainly shopkeepers. On the ground floor of the building where we lived, there was a Jewish grocer's shop. You could do your shopping there, even at midnight.
What was the coexistence like between the Jews and the Poles? What was daily life like?
There was a lot of competition, and the Jews were the masters of it. In one town in the region, there were 2 Jewish bakeries, and a Pole decided to open his own shop. Right away, the Jews started lowering their prices to eliminate their Polish competitor. That was the sort of underhand competition there was. A baker friend told me this story. It shows just how devious the Jews were.
It's the first time I've heard these words from a Polish person. Do they reflect the atmosphere that existed then between Jews and non-Jews, even though they were citizens of the same country?
The climate in 1939, when the Second World War started, was very tense. Catholicism played an important part in this too. The Church had a very national democratic view of the nation. And so that meant that in rural areas and even in towns, there was a very strong anti-Semitic tension.
When the doctor arrived in Rozwadow in 1941, the Nazi occupying force was already firmly in place. Large farms were under German management, and the Polish population reduced to slavery. They were what Hitler called inferior people, or Untermenschen. And the Jews weren't even considered as human beings by the Nazis. In Warsaw, they were confined to a ghetto. Throughout occupied Poland, they were deprived of their rights and subjected to humiliation and torture. Their extermination had started.
There was never a formal ghetto in Rozwadow, but Jewish people weren't allowed to leave the town. They received ridiculous food rations, and the Germans exploited their workforce.
There was a synagogue in Rozwadow. I remember it as a magnificent building. The Germans forced the Jews to destroy it. When they took them away to work, the Nazis forced the Jews to chant this slogan: "Our leaders have taught us nothing. Only our beloved Hitler has taught us how to work."
So how did the doctor react to the brutal repression affecting his Jewish neighbours? The people who lived just behind his fence.
A hole in my garden fence became very useful. It allowed my Jewish neighbours to access medical treatment. I went through to their side, never the reverse, for safety reasons. We had a code. A rag hooked on the fence meant that someone needed me. Once the Nazis had organized the ghettos, they banned all contact between the Jews and non-Jewish Poles. So they banned all healthcare contact. So there shouldn't have been any links. He was risking two things. The first was that the Jew in question would be killed, and he himself risked being arrested. I think it's quite possible, and it's entirely to his credit, that he may have helped Jews, but it was very dangerous.
No one would have invited witnesses. It's absurd to hope to find direct witnesses. This sort of thing went on in great secrecy.
According to his writing, the doctor fits the profile of a righteous gentile, a man who saved Jewish people at the risk of his own life. He really might be my Polish Schindler. Eugene was brave. He joined the resistance, the Armia Krajowa, the AK. Made up of up to 300,000 members, often former soldiers, the AK was the largest European resistance movement in the Second World War. It received its orders from London, from the Polish government in exile. Our tour continues in the secret premises of the local AK unit in this now abandoned building.
Before the war, this was a theater. And then when the war broke out, upstairs there was the Home Army Khedive unit, which was stationed here up in the attic space. They were responsible for all the sabotage missions, sabotaging trains, work in the factories. They sabotaged the guns. They would liquidate Germans, Polish collaborators.
Wow.
If you want to go, be careful. I'm going to use this flashlight to guide you a little bit. This was the secret hideout for the Home Army.
Huh.
This is an interesting piece. This is an old Polish soldier. In 1939, they would have had these caps. It's in pretty bad condition now, but it's the kind of stuff that you have here. So history is kind of frozen in this building. When the Khedive was going out on missions, they would have up to 50 partisans sleeping up here in this attic space. And a lot of them came back injured, you know, shot or something, and that's why we're finding all these medical bottles. And your grandfather was probably here many times helping the injured.
Well, this building is remarkable as a piece of history. It's interesting the way the stories of the people here overlap with the pieces of my grandfather's book. It's an amazing life these people led. Some people survive and some people don't, and just what a time.
This is a piece that will interest you. It is a prescription written by your grandfather in 1941. So this is the only history of your grandfather being a medical doctor in this town. Pretty much everything's been either destroyed or not found yet.
And what if these vials had been used to start the fake typhus epidemic? The one which may have allowed the doctor to save 8,000 Jews. The idea for this rescue operation came with the arrival of a university friend of Eugene's in the region, Dr. Stanislav Matolovich. In Warsaw, Matolovich had been doing research into typhus, a devastating disease. With no effective treatment, typhus terrified the Nazis.
Typhus at that time was a deadly disease. That was why the Germans were terrified of it. They didn't want it to spread through the army or the German civilian population.
Matolovich had made a remarkable discovery. By injecting a healthy patient with the Proteus OX19 bacterium, which is harmless, he obtained what is called a false positive result in the diagnostic test for typhus. In this way, he could pass off a healthy patient as someone suffering from typhus. Matolovich told his friend Eugene about his discovery, secretly. Eugene then had an idea which would change the course of his life.
We could create a fake typhus epidemic to scare the Germans, so they would stop harassing us and deporting forced laborers to the Reich. Maybe we could even stop the arrests and confiscations. The fake epidemic would wreak havoc in the German order.
Creating a fake typhus epidemic to keep the Nazis away from his patients was a brilliant idea on the part of Eugene. He'd be resisting using his weapons, the syringe and medicine. 40 years later, the two doctors published a peer-reviewed paper on their secret operation in the Scientific Journal of the American Society for Microbiology. In Poland, I meet Dr. Dominika Dziewecka at the University of Lodz. As a microbiology specialist, she's fascinated with this story.
For this fake epidemic to look credible to the Germans, they had to inject the Proteus OX19 bacterium into people who were already a bit sick. They had to have at least a cold or present the following symptoms: fever, headaches, shivering, etc.
The doctors worked in several villages. After injecting the bacterium, they sent a blood sample from the patient to a regional laboratory which was under German control. The test results all came back positive. To the Nazis, this was an epidemic.
To make the epidemic more credible, they had to respect certain criteria. They knew as doctors that typhus epidemics mainly developed in autumn and winter. So in those periods, they increased the number of injections. In addition, they were careful to make their fake epidemic spread along communication routes. We know that typhus spreads from person to person via infected lice, especially when traveling, on trains, and in crowded places in general.
We acted, of course, in the utmost secrecy. No one could know about our operation. Absolutely no one. Not even our own wives. We couldn't tell our patients either. There were too many of them. It was too dangerous.
It's hard to know if they kept a list of vaccinated people. It's unlikely, because what they were doing was an act of resistance against the occupying force. They couldn't leave any evidence.
The villagers were saved unknowingly. In that case, how could I find witnesses to the story? But in the winter of 1943, the German laboratories raised the alarm. Typhus cases were increasing at such a rate that the occupying force decided to take steps. Then aged 12, Kazek Lazowski remembers the nervousness of the Nazis.
What do you remember about this epidemic?
The Germans made the rules stricter. They banned gatherings of Polish people to prevent infection. They closed the school. Lessons stopped, and the teachers didn't come anymore. The cinema and the churches were also closed. All public places were targeted. With these measures, the Germans wanted to stop the epidemic spreading. The German authorities stopped deportations to forced labor camps in the Reich. Residents could relax a little and feel safer. Production quotas were reduced. To us, each of these posters was like a certificate recognizing the effectiveness of our operation.
But the German authorities started having doubts. Not enough people were dying in this epidemic. In early 1944, a German medical team arrived in the village of Turbia, which was in quarantine. They wanted to see the patients with their own eyes. Warned by the doctor in charge of the region, Lazowski staged his fake epidemic.
Lazowski chose the patients he would show to the Germans very carefully. He started with the thinnest, the oldest, the most wretched patients, the ones who were really suffering from serious illnesses, like pneumonia. He'd previously injected them, of course, with the Proteus OX-19. He continually warned the doctors from the German Commission about the risks of infection. He showed them the poorest, the most dilapidated, poorly lit and dirty homes. He scared the commission, and they asked Lazowski to take the blood samples himself.
The SS doctors were convinced by the performance and officially decreed that the epidemic was genuine. In his book, Lazowski was jubilant.
We won our immunological war.
This is an ending worthy of a Hollywood movie. The Nazis being fooled by the smart Poles. While the written evidence, often destroyed, of this story is limited, one meeting will be decisive in my investigation, the one with historian Dionysy Garbacz. He has examined the story of the two doctors in the regional archives, a painstaking job. In his envelope is the statement of the priests in Turbia, the village where the Germans sent their commission of SS doctors.
I found a statement from the priest, Father Blair, made in the investigation ordered by the local diocese in 1945. This is what he writes. A German commission arrived to verify the typhus cases. The German commission recognized the veracity of the epidemic. The German army didn't stop in Turbia because of the typhus. People were not forced to give their milk production quota to the Germans, and deportations of forced laborers were halted. Some young people took refuge in Turbia to avoid deportation. Around Easter, the health authorities from Krakow officially declared the epidemic was over. They said there were not enough deaths. The priest, Father Blair, and Dr. Lazowski described the same story. Exactly the same story.
As a historian, do you confirm it?
No doubt about it.
So it's certain. The doctor saved his countrymen by injecting them with a fake virus. He's a hero of the resistance. All that remains for me is the central question which will make him into my Polish Schindler or not. Were Jews among those saved, and how many?
The claims that you can find on the internet that the doctors might have saved 8,000 Jews are totally groundless. First of all, there were never 8,000 Jews here. Even up until 1942, there were only a few hundred Jews in Rozwadow. In addition, in the summer of 1942, the Germans gathered together all the Jews in the main square. They took them all to the station and deported them in freight cars. Secondly, Jews who tested positive were condemned to death. No one treated them, and they were immediately executed by the Nazis. This epidemic wasn't intended to save Jews. The doctor couldn't help them in that way.
So Polish Eugene won't be the one to dethrone the German Oskar Schindler. He He was certainly a hero of the resistance, but he couldn't have saved 8,000 Jews as some websites claim, including those of Jewish organizations. But where has this ridiculous and dangerous rumor come from? I decide to set off on the trail of the people who first published the information. "67 years after the events in Chicago, USA, in August 2001, the Chicago Sun-Times, one of America's leading daily newspapers, published on its front page an article with an eye-catching headline, "Chicago's Schindler." It was the incredible story of a Polish doctor who arrived in America in 1958. Eugène Lazowski, who was said to have saved 8,000 people, Jews and non-Jews. The author of the article is Art Golab, a journalist. But what were his sources? I decide to call him.
Hello, is this Mr. Golab speaking? I have the Polish version of his book, and he never mentions that he saved any Jews. So I was just wondering where this information was coming from.
If my article doesn't mention any other confirming sources, that probably means I couldn't find it. And ideally, we would have been able to find somebody who's Jewish and was saved. I don't have a lot of contacts in Poland.
The title is quite catchy. I mean, everybody knows who Schindler was. How did this idea come up?
Well, like so many newspaper reporters, I did not have control over the title. That story was very heavily edited by my boss. He came up with that title. I wouldn't say it was the most accurate with a story about just saving Poles. I mean, it's an interesting story, but we wouldn't have run it, probably, or it would have run a lot smaller.
That statement leaves me speechless. What if the key to the secret lay in the United States? After all, his family still lives there. Eugène moved there after the war with his wife and his daughter Alexandra, who was born in 1942 in Rozwadow. After living for 40 years in Chicago, where he worked as a pediatrician at the hospital and the university, he moved to Oregon. This is where I meet his daughter Alexandra and her husband Don.
Oh yeah, there was a difficult relationship with my father. He didn't say anything to me about anything that's been happening. He never talked about it.
He never mentioned what he did with the serum.
Until it came out in the book.
Until it came out in the book.
But the little-known hero would soon become famous.
Joseph.
The major thing was that there was the Chicago Sun-Times called him a Schindler of Chicago. And from there on, the newspapers picked up people calling all the time.
How did he react when the media interest grew around his...
He gobbled it up. He was so happy. Every attention he got, he was so happy. He was just the happiest guy in the world, that he finally is famous for something.
But did Eugène know the people were trying to make him into a hero of the Holocaust?
I think my father realized that, but my father liked the publicity so much that he didn't pay any, it didn't dawn on him that later that exactly what he actually wrote. But, that keeps it going, people interesting.
My investigation put me on the trail of a young woman who met the doctor at that time. In Chicago, I'm meeting Alyssa Parcham. As a history student in 2001, she came across the article in the Chicago Sun-Times and decided to write her dissertation on the doctor's actions.
I thought that he had done something very similar to Oskar Schindler. He found a way to save many Jewish people during the Holocaust, and the fact that he was a doctor made it more intriguing to me because he wasn't, he didn't have a factory, he didn't have a place to, how do you hide people? And so I contacted Art Golab from the Chicago Sun-Times and asked him if I could get some of his references and stories, and he pretty much brushed me off.
So Alyssa decided to meet Eugene in person.
And within 5 minutes of talking to him, I realized that the story had nothing to do with what Dr. Lazowski had done. He was actually ashamed that it had been turned into something that wasn't true. He was upset that the news had been falsified.
After talking to Lazowski, Alyssa called the Sun-Times again and asked to speak to the editor.
His editor kind of said, well, we're sorry, but they weren't going to reprint a retraction or do anything. And so I was very disenchanted with the media, we'll say, at the time, because they just wanted to sell papers. They didn't really want to hear a real story.
So what was Eugene's place in this story? Was he really annoyed that people said he'd done heroic actions which he hadn't? Lazowski died on the 13th of December 2006, a few days before his 93rd birthday. Dr. Matulovich made his career at the University of Congo in Zaire. After he returned to Poland, he disappeared from view. What remains is their story, which is no longer theirs.
Stories that are discovered late, like that of Lazowski told in the article, show just how much people like to romanticize the Holocaust and the Second World War. It's not a uniquely American phenomenon. We always want the stories to be extraordinary, and we add all sorts of details. We see it in films, in books. I call it a sort of Holocaust kitsch.
Today, the guardians of the temple are perhaps the members of Eugene's family. In Oregon, over a meal, I see Mark again, his grandson whom I first met in Rozwadow. Far from repeating the legend, he sticks to the facts.
My grandfather's story is remarkable, and it's remarkable if you stick to the truth of it. The Holocaust feels like a sacred object. It's something that you don't lie about, and that would have been important to him, and the truth of his story, I think, would have been important to him. That I can't stop.
Unfortunately for Mark, the article in the Chicago Sun-Times in 2001 has had a snowball effect. It's been reproduced endlessly on the internet without anyone ever taking the trouble to check it. Italy, Great Britain, and finally France, in the Figaro, where I discovered it 4 years ago. After being forgotten for years, Eugene's legend intrigues people in his own country. Its rediscovery coincides with efforts by the authorities to promote the Polish righteous, both at home and abroad. Indeed, few people know that Poland has the highest number in the world, almost 7,000.
Their behavior was really heroic. Their motivation isn't important. They risked their lives and those of their families. But they were the exception rather than the rule.
All the survivors, all the Jews who lived through the war, who lived in Poland, very often have an ambiguous memory of the attitude of Polish people. They were often saved, or they were able to escape because of one Pole. But for one Pole who helped them, they all have so many stories of Poles who betrayed them.
There's a tendency to treat history a bit like a buffet, where you choose the best bits. You choose the righteous, but you forget the collaborators. You forget the nuances that grew out of indifference or fear.
What has happened to the memory of Eugène Lazowski in his own region? In Stalowa Wola, I'm going to the Cyprian Norwid High School to visit the Students' Film Club. They've invited me to watch a short film they've made for International Holocaust Remembrance Day. The theme chosen by the local authority is the story of Dr. Lazowski's fake epidemic.
Typhus again.
But doctor, I thought it was pneumonia.
I'm sorry.
What impressed me was that the doctor was taking a risk. I wonder what I would have done in his place. My friends and I didn't know this story. I wanted to reach people of my generation with this film.
As a history teacher, I have an obligation to truth. I think this kind of film should be shown in Israeli schools too. It shows a person who didn't differentiate between Jews and non-Jews, but acted solely according to his ethics as a doctor. This sort of attitude should be promoted generally in Israel.
Typhus? But I've only got a cold. Doctor, are we going to die?
No, not you, child.
The teacher and her students, like many others before them, seem to have interpreted the legend of the Polish Schindler literally. He was a member of the resistance, but it's impossible to prove that he was a righteous gentile. My journey ends in Israel, where I make one final discovery. At Yad Vashem, where the righteous are registered, there are indeed some Lazowskis. Not Eugène, but his parents, Kazimierz and Zofia. They obtained this honor posthumously in 1995 for saving 6 Jews in Warsaw. In Jerusalem, I meet someone who can confirm their deeds, Ilana Helling. The daughter and granddaughter of a family hidden by the couple from 1943.
It was heroism at the time, that's for sure, because most of the population didn't do it. So I think they were, maybe in a way, they were heroes.
The irony of the story is that one hero may hide others. But Eugène and Stanislav also did something remarkable. It was tarnished in the end by media flattery and certain people's agendas. Let us always pursue our duty of remembrance without compromise, so that truth isn't betrayed.